spicy, I guess.
Yeah, probably. Right, hey guys, we're back again with the book club, and we're exploring today the ways in which communism and liberalism actually are very similar, believe it or not. This is Rizyard Legutko's book, The Demon in Democracy, and there are plenty of connections to the concepts we've looked at in Plato. Joining me is Dr. Robillard, ex-Oxford. I'm ex-Eton, and this is our selection of books that we feel set out important but neglected concepts in contemporary culture. Dr. Robillard, how are you today?
Not bad. I'm hearing a double effect though of hearing your voice come through twice with about a one
Ah,
second delay.
okay. Let me see if I can get the echo cancellation switched on for sure.
It's not even so much echo. It's like you're. I still hear you talking right now.
Oh, right, that's just a delay then. Yeah, weird. I
Yeah.
don't know how to fix that. Hopefully it will fix itself soon.
Hmm.
Sometimes you
Okay.
get a bit of a lag on the live streams.
Oh, Roger. All right.
If you guys watching noticed anything, let us know. But we will begin with our normal prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom, pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen. Right, important concepts then that we need to explore, connecting Legutko's account of the demon in democracy to Plato's ideas about how we degenerate from the ideal regime of the philosopher kings to the tyrannical regime when democracy fully collapses because the passions, the base appetites have been unleashed and unseat reason as the ruling principle in the soul. He argues that societies or political states are ultimately just the expression of spiritual states of the individuals that make up those societies. And interestingly, Legutko says that the liberal democratic man, unchallenged and totally secure in his rule, will reign over human aspirations like a tyrant. That's just like Plato, isn't it?
Yeah, it sounds very very much like Plato. Yeah, that the microscopic reflects the macroscopic in society.
Right. Now, why is it for people who are new to this idea and probably thinking it sounds implausible? What? Liberalism and communism, they are the same? Beneath the surface, how can they be the same?
So yeah, so Lagoko grew up in communist-occupied Poland, and they were liberated in 1989. And he then sees the majority of that society begin really wanting to, rather than really run with their own national sovereignty, they're suddenly chattering to be absorbed into the EU and seek to be part of this new kind of regulative and macro level collective entity. And he just, under the guise of democratic liberalism or under the auspices of liberalism. And that is what got him thinking as to, well, maybe there's some similarities in which these ostensibly two differing political systems are actually very similar. And he starts saying, or realizing that they're both the consequences of modernity. They both have a very uh, revolutionary utopian project to them, a telos towards changing man and changing the world. And the anthropology of man is definitely non-traditional and non-Christian. Uh, and he starts, teasing out the ways in which these ostensibly opposing worldviews are actually very similar underneath.
Right. And it takes some painful thinking to reach that conclusion because for so many people, liberalism is all about what it says on the tin freedom. You can do whatever you like. You can live and be your own hero. But it's funny, isn't it? The actual experience of it ends up being do your own thing, but stop being such a bigot. Don't behave like that.
Yeah, it ends up being a kind of calcified or mandatory tolerance, a mandatory pluralism, a mandatory inclusiveness, where everyone's allowed to be their own liberal individual, so as long as they don't have any thick commitments to anything that's really worth living or dying for.
Mm,
So it's the world becomes a very thin surface level experience, and that in and of itself becomes its own kind of tyranny.
right. And it's interesting that this particular idea we're looking at now, Legutko says it happens being unchallenged and totally secure only once Christianity has been basically jettisoned or supplanted. So we get rid of that traditional view of man and culture, and then liberalism is free. Now, this sounds quite familiar to us from Fraser's account of the real motivations for moving away from final causality in the Aristotelian Thomistic world picture.
Mhm. The yeah, his quoting of Nagel in particular points out that if we remove any really obligation to a higher authority, and we are now just these lone atomized individuals in a, a fundamentally meaningless world, then yeah, we're free to do as thou wilt. We're free to chase as many of our appetites as possible under ostensibly, I don't know, human rights, some type of contractualism,
Mm,
uh, and that's the, the connection that Phaser draws out.
right. If it's all about letting people be happy according to whatever their own personal conception of the good is, then why not, as Plato argues, have all day long orgies and drunken festivals? That's going to make people happy in some
Yeah,
sense of
sure.
the word.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's some people out there that might be their whim, that might be what they want, so it's their right. So
Right.
here we go. Yeah.
There we go. So liberalism is get paid, get laid, and no constraints on that. This is what Plato was talking about with the young men in particular in societies like this being interested in nothing except luxury and pleasure. Now, Legutko says that he noticed, as you briefly outlined there, all the noble goals that people were talking about after the fall of communism actually just becoming a new wave of barbarism under the ideological spell of liberal democracy. Now, for long term listeners who have followed this whole series, they might be thinking here of Havel's account of
Mm,
the ideological spell. Now,
right.
what was this, and why do you think there's a connection between the two?
In Havel's point in Power of the Powerless, he points out how that when the people in the society had the religion and deep commitments to nation, family, land had been removed, people they still need a framework by which to operate. They need a framework to make sense of the world. So the ideology of the mass society of consumerism of the automatism ended up filling in that void for a lot of folks. So the it's not like their capacity to believe went away. It just removing religion created a void that then got filled, but with the new regime of consumerism, automatism, and really just obedience to whatever the masses were doing.
Right. And this is the idea that there is a God shaped hole at the heart of the human being because our final end really is God. We're built for worship. So we have to end up worshipping something. It's just
Mm,
if it's not God, it ends up as idolatry. So this ideology ends up as a kind of idol. And we'll see from Legutko's comments that it demands worship. It demands what he calls the like public expression of the
Mm.
inner pious doctrine, as we've seen in businesses, schools, etc., decked out in rainbow flags. It's got the same
Yeah.
kind of logic as communism.
Yep.
So people are falling under the spell then because they are craving some kind of metaphysical answer to meaning, value, and purpose. And this is
Mm.
why you see even atheist philosophers like Schopenhauer, for example, acknowledging that man is the animum metaphysicum, the metaphysical animal, as he put it. So liberalism will present itself as being opposed to religion, but really it's a surrogate religion.
Mm.
And the same is true
Yeah.
with communism too.
Yeah. Definitely.
I thought this was a really strong connection to Plato's account of what happens to students and teachers, to parents and children. Legutko noticed that the rules of civility were cast aside for loutish manners and coarse language.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree, once again, in these instances, what the causal arrow is, and whether to what degree it's looping. Is it that the spiritual degeneration of the citizens then manifests itself in etiquette and rules of civility and decency going away, or rather is it the primary driver, the rules of civility and decency and etiquette go away, and then that sort of demoralizes people and makes them less uh, spirited. Uh, I'd imagine it's looping, but that's just the first thing that comes to mind.
What's your hunch about which one is likely to be the most important factor? I know Plato's view is that the function of law is to help citizens towards virtue. So if you're living in a bad society, right, where let's say abortion is legal as it is now, then it's going to make it harder for you to live a good life because you're going to have people telling you that it's an okay choice. And many other things that aren't virtuous are also legal and you're entitled to pursue them, they say. So someone living in that kind of world is going to have a harder chance of a harder task of staying on the straight and narrow than someone being
Mm.
guided properly, right?
Certainly, yeah, yes, and then the soft pressures of etiquettal norms also have their own shaping effect, where people are that adds another layer to which hems people in from living a virtuous life.
Mm. So, given that there's this misconception that law or politics are downstream from a culture, what we see really with the way this ideology is imposed on society is it's actually a top down phenomenon. So culture is downstream of law. You get people at the top in law, in media and education as well. And then that's the real root of the revolution. It's from the elite. My hunch would be that if you can get control of the laws, first of all, then that's probably the most significant factor in bringing about this kind of change. But
Mm.
taking Plato's view that this is all ultimately an expression of a spiritual state anyway, the desire to change those laws stems from a severing of the link between man and God and opposition to natural law anyway. That's
Yes.
why if we're thinking about the devil as the prince of this world, as Christians must, then I think something happened around the Enlightenment where man, for the first time, really conceived of a project that was focused on mastery of nature, including human nature, and on this kind of radical autonomy and being able to remake himself or set himself up in opposition to God. And since then, I think we've seen the consequences that Legutko's outlining here and
Mm.
what we tracked in Plato books 8 and 9 as well.
Yeah, certainly a hubris with respect to controlling nature and hubris with respect to controlling human nature.
Right. Now, what are the rules of civility, really? Someone's asked the question here. Are rules of civility based off of culture or religion? You got some thoughts about that one?
I mean, I would say they're manifestations of our own conscience and regarding one another with some reciprocal level of decency, as a default level of decency. Um, regard for property, regard for uh, loving thy neighbor, just being not seeking to impose your will upon persons unnecessarily. I don't walk down the street and walk through people. We both mutually give way as we're passing one another. Um, you and I have talked at length. Duties that men have to protect women and children. To be courteous. I think these are ultimately like inborn features of our conscience, and in that sense,
Say a
derivative
bit
of.
more about that. Inborn, because we've been talking a lot about natural law while discussing
Mhm.
phaser.
Yeah.
And the question, in my opinion, is actually presenting this false dichotomy between culture and religion, because what you really get is that culture is always religious.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
one of the
Yeah,
points that
and
Christopher
yeah,
Dawson makes so well. And the liberal will say, no, it's not, because liberalism isn't religious. But the catch is it is.
mm,
Liberalism is a theocracy. Its God is just different. So you do have a surrogate religion. All culture is
yes,
religious. So that's
yeah,
the, in a nutshell, answer to the question. But to say why, it's that you can't have a civilization without natural law and have it be successful. So the rules of civility are ultimately based on our duties to one another, given the kind of creatures we are, i.e., rational, and the fact that societies are about the flourishing of the common good. So rules of civility are going to be ways in which we socially exaggerate the basic facts of natural law anyway. So let's think about the way that women are supposed to dress, for example, and men are supposed to dress at something like a black tie event or a more formal occasion. Well, what we tend to do is accentuate the differences between the sexes and the various roles that stem from those under natural law. So it'll be something about the grace or femininity of women wearing high heels, for example, and then men, because they're not so much valued on what they look like, but rather on how they perform, what they do. Think about the way that an evening gown on a woman is compared to just black tie on a man.
mm, mm,
So a healthy culture will accentuate the differences between men and women that already exist and give different roles for them by natural law. A sick one will say, okay, well, it'll end up saying there's no difference between men and women ultimately.
I was gonna say this. You go off the rails really quickly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it'll just deny them. But before it gets to that point, it will
mm,
blur them. It will
yeah,
blur them and say these things don't matter. You know what? In fact, why don't we have mixed sports, for example? We now think it's civil for a man to punch a woman in the face.
right. Yeah, it becomes normalized.
Yeah. John Gray's Straw Dogs book brilliantly outlines modern humanism as the faith that it is. Yeah, he's to the extent that uh, he's heavily influenced by Nietzsche, and to the extent that, like Nietzsche, he understands the consequences of the death of God. And Nietzsche didn't have any arguments really against God. He just noticed the fact that people weren't taking belief in him seriously as like a diagnosis of why that's sick and the way it affects culture. John Gray is quite good, same as Nietzsche, but in terms of actual answers and trying to be consistent in laying out what objective values without God might be, just like everyone else, he can't do it. But some of his writing is good to look at for sure. Right. So Lugutko has these three big things that he wants to stress as the parallels, the connections between liberalism and communism. You hinted at them earlier. They are, for him, anthropological minimalism, a progressive view of history, and belief in the idea of equality. Let's
Mm.
think about what each one means in a bit more detail. We talked a bit about philosophical anthropology, with Fraser in particular. What do we mean by it, and why is it so important? If people get this wrong, why can't they get anything right?
So, as we've noticed that Phaser outlines, we move from the Aristotelian worldview, where telos is removed from that world picture, and that infects everything. It infects, in particular, our view of humankind and human nature. Then, as we enter into modernity, we see these various competing, really just various forms of contractualism that attempt to build a political system based upon a conception of mankind where telos has been removed. So, whether in the Western modern tradition, whether it's Rousseau or Hobbes or Locke or Mill or um, Kant, you have all these folks going about the project of saying, how do we come up with a, a political regime, a political order that is good? But from the jump, we've already thrown out telos. We've already thrown out that man has any sort of fundamental nature, that men and women have any fundamental natures. And then that's the starting point upon which they then build their various political systems. And then Marx obviously jumps in along some way and comes up with the various iterations of Marxism, where the new Soviet man is now the new anthropology of man upon which society is going to build or at least aim towards. So, in that sense, liberalism and communism both start with a wrong-headed conception of mankind, of man's nature.
Right. And just to be clear, not only do they have difficulty in reconciling the different conceptions of what the good life is, they lack any objective account of what good is. So in principle, because liberalism has removed telos or final causality, they
Mm-hmm.
can't say what is good for man. Man's
Experiment, yeah.
literally good for nothing.
Pursuit of happiness, experiments in living, yeah.
Right.
Figure it out for yourself. Yeah.
So the idea that there's this conception of justice which is based on an agreed upon idea of the good, that goes.
That goes, and I mean, if you really want to get down to like how do we even get agreement off the ground is another problem that these folks have to deal with. But yeah, yeah, how do we come to agreement, and then how do we come to agreement over the what the good is for individuals or our collective project is going to be quite difficult for any of these folks to answer
Yeah. Right.
without smuggling in without smuggling in remnants of Christian and Aristotelian metaphysics.
Right. And now let's get to those now, points 2 and 3. So the problem with number 1 is that politics is a branch of moral philosophy because we have to know what policies are good to decide which ones to pursue. And what makes a policy good is going to depend on what is good for human beings living in that particular polity. And if we don't know that, we can't pick between different options, at least not consistently anyway.
Mm.
But the problem with these people is they've got no problem being inconsistent, as they show time and time again. And you've been outlining very consistently. So whether it's hardcore materialist Darwinist scientists saying that there's a particular aim or goal that evolution has in mind or a particular body part has in mind, they're always borrowing concepts from the realm of telos and final causality that really they shouldn't be accessing at all.
Mm. Yes.
Now, one is that history has some kind of goal that we are working towards, the Whig interpretation of history that you often bring up.
Yes.
Does this borrow anything from Christianity, do you think?
It does sound like Christian in the sense of that we're all directed towards some final end. However, they're rather than an end of apocalypse and particular and final judgment and Christ's return, these folks, it's more we're going to create. We're moving towards some sort of secular utopia on Earth, whether it's the Marxist, communist secular utopia or the liberal secular utopia. Both of them seem to presume that they're both projects of making reality consistently better and better and better towards some secular utopian end, which is almost the reverse direction of the Christian direction of travel.
Yeah, let's say a bit more about that. So Christianity looks back and sees Eden, looks back and sees the golden age, as classical myth put it. And all world religions are like that. In the past, go far enough back, things were good. Like in Hinduism as well, the Kali Yuga, so
Mm-hmm.
the end times, the bad stage, look ahead, and then we get problems. Christianity says, look far enough ahead, you get the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
But this progressive view of history does what no human society has ever done before. No myth, no religion. It says, Dark Age is behind us, bright, shining, the golden society, as Bertrand Russell put it, in the future.
Yeah,
So it is an inversion.
yeah, it is an inversion, and yeah, it's very much teleologically laden in its narrative. The transhumanists have the same thing too. You know, if we look at those guys, you know, we're just going to upload our minds into the digital oversoul, and everything will be better.
And it's funny that this goes hand in hand with the anthropological minimalism, because what it really assumes when you think about it is people are basically good and perfectible,
Mm. Yep.
not even by God, but by themselves. So just
Yes.
from our own power, we can put ourselves up by our shoelaces and eventually turn ourselves into something fantastic. That's the basic assumption about human nature at the heart of this, isn't it?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and it's seems to be completely deaf to prior historical precedents, uh, as these projects kind of have shown themselves to fail again and again and again.
Sure,
Any type of man-made utopian project.
that's it. There's that Helen Pinkerton poem that I love on Goya's Jewel with Cudgels. There's a
Mm,
video of it on my channel, and she has the great line that this isn't heaven brought down to earth, it's hell raised up. And
yeah.
this is how these projects always end. The more bloodless the political philosophy, the bloodier the
Mm,
reality it brings about. Why is that? Because the Catholic view of human beings as being more inclined to vice than to virtue,
mm,
naturally, because of the fall or concupiscence, is true. It takes a lot of work for us to be good, and it also takes God's help. We have to ask and we have to cooperate to become what we ought to be. We can't just do it through our own power,
mm,
because whereas Islam says that man is deficient in knowledge of God merely, there's no problem with man's will. Christianity says that not only is our intellect darkened by the consequences of the fall, like Aquinas was talking about in the opening prayer we read today, but also our will or our heart, our desires are darkened too. So it's not just an intellectual thing, it's a what do we crave, what do we want thing too. Not totally depraved, like Luther and Calvin, for example, would argue, not totally
mm.
depraved, but significantly. And
Right.
that's why you're never going to build this bright, shining society just off your own back.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, heaven on earth, the new heaven, the new earth of Christianity brought about by Christ's return, making all things anew, so that even matter is redeemed. That gets taken as one of the enduring elements of Christianity that gets transported into liberalism. What about equality as well? That sounds kind of Christian to me. There's a sense in which we are all equally made in the image of God, isn't there?
Certainly, yeah, certainly with equal dignity and equal essentialness to our humanity. So yeah, in that sense, we are equal in uh, intellect and will in God's image. But the secular version of it, excuse me while I plug my energy source in. Don't cut out. Sorry about this, guys.
That's right, no worries. Yeah, what he's saying there about essentially equal is a really important point because if you take one of the uh, naturalist, more Darwinian talking points, they'll say, oh, there's IQ differences between men and women, which there are. There are IQ differences between different races, which there are. This means that we're not all uh, equally made in the image of God. No, doesn't follow because IQ, for example, this isn't a difference in kind. It's a difference in uh, degree. You still both possess an intellect, which is what makes you capable of abstract thought. You've either got it or you haven't. It's not a spectrum, it's absolute. Do you have an intellect? Yes, you do. That's what makes you human, a rational animal. That's what makes you made in the image of God. Nobody cares if your IQ is 180, 190 versus 70, 80. In fact, without God, you're going to be much more of a pain in the ass with a 180 IQ than a 70 or 80 IQ. Because just like the devil, who was the brightest angel and ends up the worst without God, because of that, because he's got such
Mhm.
great potential for damage, most of the people who've done the worst things in human history are really smart.
Right. Yep. Yep. Yeah, definitely. The yeah, the only thing I would add to that, yeah, is the essence accident distinction as well, where we can have equality in our essences, but still differentiation in our various accidents, and that's completely consistent.
Right. And an even more basic misconception would be that uh, if someone has been born without a limb, that they're not made in the image of God. That's
Mm-hmm.
just completely like, you know, age 5, 6 year old kids understanding of what being made in the image of God means. Remember the gradations we went through and in Phaser about ideas about God? And one of the most basic was Richard Dawkins' understanding as Sky Daddy. So
Mm-hmm.
being made in the image of God isn't about looking like him physically. It's about intellect and free will. So you can be born with no legs, you're still made in the image of God, because we're not saying that God has legs. He did when he was incarnated, but that's not what being made in the image of God means. So we're equal in Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
intellect and will. But how can we say we're all equal if we remove all of that? In what sense does liberalism have grounds for saying everyone's equal?
I guess now we import this notion of rights. You know, we need equal rights, or on the communist flip side is the equality of outcome or equality of physical stuff, I guess. But at least on the liberal democratic worldview that Laguco is critiquing, then it's going to be these amorphous, highly undefined rights claims that are going to need to be the thing that are equally apportioned. It seems.
Yeah, we'll get on more to that in a second. And the other thing is that, as Plato was pointing out, the idea that there's anything better than anything else, the idea of hierarchy, that goes as we slip from democracy to tyranny, even between truth and error. So
Hmm.
Nietzsche's famous question, why truth? Like, why can't truth and lies be equal?
Right. Yep. Yeah. Once you get to that point, then I mean, your society's lost. Essentially, you know, if that is, you can make no your society can allow no differentiation whatsoever between truth or falsity, then you can't get good or evil. You can't get beauty and ugliness. You can't get the something that's praiseworthy or profane. All of it goes. But yeah, if you do regard that there's a distinction between truth and falsity, then all those other things start coming back, and you start to get differentiation. You can't have equality between truth and falsity, or between every possible perspective in the world. Certain views, certain perspectives, certain claims are going to be on the money and right. Other ones are going to be false.
And that has big consequences for something like education. Plato was
Mm.
right when he said that two of the most important questions in any society are who is teaching the children, number one, what are they teaching them, number two. Now, if we've got hierarchy and things being rightly ordered, then some things are more important to teach than others, like truth rather than error, for example, goodness rather than evil, and beauty rather than ugliness. And that idea that there's discrimination and taste is deeply offensive to some people who've been indoctrinated with the idea that whatever they want is best and they can give free rein to any desires they happen to have.
Certainly, and that in a weird way. I mean, I guess nowadays we're at a point where it's not just like there's a it's not even like there's equality anymore. It's like an inverted hierarchy now, where those are now the views that are in fashion and mandatory and sticking up for any classically true, right, good, beautiful ideas are now
Yeah.
the underdog. So it's not even just the equality between the views. It's an inversion.
Yeah. Gay marriage isn't just equal to marriage, it's actually better than marriage. that's that's what they have
Right,
to come
right,
up with.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That,
uh,
that's yeah, because that's the new thing, and the new
yeah,
thing is presumed to be always better.
yeah.
Heading towards
I got
whatever
another
whatever
one.
the next best thing is.
I got another one.
What's that?
You know what? That a trans woman isn't just a woman; she's more of a woman
Yes,
than a
yes,
woman is.
yes. You're right. Yeah, Bruce Jenner is more of a woman than a actual woman is.
Well,
Yeah,
that's why she won Woman of the Year without having been a woman for a year.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we've got a question.
Yep.
Let's bring it in. Can we see it? Or have I enlarged it too much? All right, we can just about see it. Can you comment on the concept of the good of privacy or ordinariness or minding your own business in the Republic? Do you want to take this one? I've got a couple of thoughts on it based on what the point of work is and what the point of leisure is and the importance of contemplation. But I'll let you have a stab at it first.
Um,
Why
I would,
why is
yeah.
privacy good?
I think privacy is good insofar as people, they need a rest from the polis. They don't need to be. Everyone needs to be a political agent at all moments, and there are domains that are outside of the public political that are necessary for human flourishing and are particular. So, this is the space, like you said, of leisure, of various, personal interests, and that doesn't need to be totally overtaken by politics or vice versa. I think in a normal functioning society, that they always say that it's polite to not talk about politics or money or religion, but I think now everything's become so politicized that the public and the private are now just blended, so you can't really get away from it. I'm
Mm.
rambling, so why don't you
No,
jump
that's
in?
not rambling. That's really important. So it's the liberal ideology is totalitarian by nature because it wants to infiltrate everything, impose everything, and the personal becomes the political. So the
Hmm.
question's a really sensible one because why is the personal valuable? Well, it's because the society, in Plato's view, is ultimately a reflection of the spiritual condition of the individuals that make it up. And the natural law tradition, as Aristotle and Aquinas put it, says that the society exists for the individual ultimately. A society doesn't have an immortal soul or an immortal eternal destiny, but the individual does. So, man is a social animal because he needs others to bring him to perfection. So, if you're thinking about all the different great books that we've got access to, the accumulated wisdom of the heritage of the West, we can learn so much more. We can make so much more progress in knowledge and virtue, which is what our telos is aimed at, using that than we could off our own backs. Now, this is why it's important. Society helps fulfill us as individuals, and privacy is good because the purpose of work is to give you the opportunity to develop your contemplation, develop your mind, your intellect in your leisure time. So that's what it's about, really. It's the spiritual value of it. But if you dispute that there's any kind of spiritual objective values in the first place, or that people have a soul, then you flatten everything, like Marx, for
Mhm.
example, to merely economic factors.
Mhm.
Like, what is all this philosophy? Why would you want to listen to classical music or something? Why would you want to look at a picture? In fact, for Marx, you've got no free will at all. So none of it really makes any sense, all those kind of pursuits.
It's funny that you mentioned that. The I guess the flip side of this, one could say that capitalism or modern liberal democracy itself is equally and sees mankind as just economic man. It's just a different kind of economic man. It's a similar kind of flattening
Mm,
and a similar kind of um, utility function that's being brought to bear on a world that's far more richer than just utility.
for sure. People on the right often underappreciate that fact. People like Chesterton and Dawson were very clear that communism and capitalism are equally opposed to the truth of Catholic social doctrine. Chesterton even said that capitalism did more to destroy the family than communism did. That's some of the
Mm.
reactions you get to that. People get irrationally triggered by this, but in basically being economic liberalism, capitalism is very good at dissolving the family, and
Mm.
making the market the dominant institution is another form of leveling as a substitute for order.
Mm. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, Christopher Dawson is a historian who turned down a university post, and there was some controversy over his being Roman Catholic, but he's probably the best writer on the relationship between culture and religion. If let me try and find it. If you can get a hold of it, the best book to get by him, it's not in print anymore, but is this one here, Christianity and European Culture. It's just a selected edition. Gerald Rossello, that's the one to go for. Gives the best overview. And then the other one that's really good, I've got it here somewhere. Can I see it right now? No, I can't see it right now. Religion and the Rise of Western Culture. Religion and the Rise of Western Culture. So he's got the best account of why culture is ultimately religious. Right. Actually, this is spot on for what we were talking about just then.
Right.
So,
Intrusion. Yeah.
yeah, both systems strongly, this is communism and liberalism, and so to speak, impatiently intrude into the social fabric.
Hmm.
This is like
Yeah.
Hubble, yeah?
Yes. Very much like Hubble. Yeah. The panorama gets infected by the ideology, and everything you do needs to be seen through the lens of the ideology, but and reinforced by your peers.
Why?
Well, I guess the ideology is self perpetuating, and if we've already somehow got to the correct presupposition that the traditional worldview is false, then we need to we need to keep doubling down on this new better future that we're heading towards.
And Havel's idea was also that because the regime is weak, it needs the display of allegiance from more and more people to give it the illusion of strength.
Yes, yeah, it's brittle, and that's why the one act of the shopkeeper taking down one sign is looked at with by the system as this alarming action of disobedience that needs to be aggressively stomped out. In the same way that cancel culture does this to anybody who might give a patriarchy talk at Eden, for instance, or some of
Yeah,
our other friends and colleagues who dare say obviously true things.
yeah,
Yeah, the system it can't it can't risk any type of tipping points.
that's it. And then if they also happen to have a thicker than average neck, they'll get teased about that as well because it
There you
must
go.
mean they're really stupid.
That is also threatening and
That's
targeted.
not allowed. You
No,
you can't
it's
decide to live like that.
it's neck shaming. Yeah.
So we've got in both liberalism and communism an inner compulsion to manifest pious loyalty to the doctrine. Great explanation of what we see rolled out in email signatures, in advertising campaigns, in schools, in kneeling for BLM. All these public displays of pious loyalty to the doctrine. And they're expected for the reasons that you just outlined then.
Yeah. Yeah. The doctrine has it's self perpetuating, and it has no tolerance for any disobedience or any falling out of step.
Right. Accordingly, Logutko says, and this is just spot on, isn't it? It's monopolized the public space and invaded schools, popular culture, academic life, and advertising. Cancel culture is part of the monopolization process. Accordingly, he says that democracy, or this is from Plato, sorry, we need to get onto Popper's objections to Plato now, which is that having just outlined for you the connection between liberalism and communism, we wanted to talk a bit about why Popper, Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, 20th century, objected to Plato's account of what a good regime would look like. So let's say you've been listening along so far and you think, okay, yeah, sure. I can see there are problems with liberalism, and Logutko has helped me to understand some of the parallels with communism, and I can see that Plato was right in his account of how the regimes can degenerate from the best to the worst. But what is the alternative to liberalism? What are we going to be accepting instead? There are many people who say, yeah, okay, it's bad, but anything else is worse. Anything else is totalitarianism. It's going to be about authority, and authority is a bad word. It reminds me of Stalin and Hitler.
Right. Right.
Popper gives some of the standard objections himself. Number one is that Plato is an example of authoritarian intellectualism. There's that word again. You bring up authority, and people feel the hairs on the back of their neck go up.
Hmm.
This is a
Hmm.
bad word. It sounds like someone's a fascist if you say authority. He argues that Plato's view is actually fundamentally identical with totalitarianism because it's saying that there really is a best way to live. There's a good way to order a society. And for Popper, this sounds totalitarian. Another point is that we've got scientific rationalism for Popper is the only way to really pursue truth. Plato, with all these pesky metaphysical claims, sounds like he's going to be trouble to Popper. Let's take these three as a group before we get on to the other two. What
Hmm.
is at the heart of this idea that Plato is an authoritarian, do you think?
I think from Popper's perspective, anything that looks hierarchical, he's going to see as being authoritarian, pernicious authoritarianism, and identical with totalitarianism. So any hierarchy, he's going to presume, to something like, I don't know, that natural law might generate of its own accord, might look contrary to the equality project of liberal democracy that seems to be operating in the background of Popper's politics here.
And why is that? It seems strange that just because Plato has an ethical system which is based on metaphysical anthropology of man that says, look, we can't just say anything goes. There really is an objective good for human beings.
Mhm.
Why do you think that's such an assault to Popper's sensibilities? Sounds like Popper's just giving a liberal response to this. No, I want to be able to invent my own good.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and one thing here that I think is the critique that we could level against Popper is that he's still engaging in a values claim, right? So there's a meta intolerance that he's taking part in, insofar as saying that liberal democracies are better than Plato's Republic. So in that sense, um, he's being he's making a judgment.
Mm.
So that's a kind of totalitarianism. That's kind of a values claim by its own lights. And then secondly, as you said, if he's a scientific rationalist, it's unclear where the meta-ethical underpinning of liberal democracy or any system, right, is getting any of its foundations. I don't know. He's just sort of speaking this into thin air and saying, well, this is obviously the best system, just because,
Right.
without giving any further. There's nothing scientific about that values claim.
Exactly. That's it. So it's another form of the inconsistency we've seen from this viewpoint so often.
Yeah.
And Popper holds up Socrates as the skeptical ideal, the doubter, the guy who isn't dogmatic because he hasn't discovered some kind of truth which Popper feels is going to destroy actual freedom.
Mm.
But that's not really true because in his apology, Socrates does express several convictions that are
Yes. Yeah.
positive. So
Yep.
John Wilde, writing on Popper's objections to Plato, says that Socrates says first, there is a divine being higher than man, possessing a wisdom compared to which human wisdom is as nothing. That's one conviction.
Mm-hmm.
Second, vice and injustice, evils of the soul, are worse than sickness and death, evils of the body, which implies that man is a composite of body and soul, and that the soul is more important than the body. Sounds like Plato, right?
Yep.
Third, tending the soul is more important than tending the body. Fourth, virtue depends primarily on knowledge. And fifth, it is not so evil to suffer injustice as to do it. So even Socrates, who Popper presents as the sensible, skeptical alternative to the dogmatic Plato, actually does have these positive commitments about what a good
Mm-hmm.
life is. It's not all up for
Yep.
grabs.
It isn't. Yeah, it isn't. And yeah, I think that's great that Wilde was able to point that out.
So we've got the fact that Socrates himself is, in Popper's terms anyway, an authoritarian regarding truth, in that he has these claims that are standards that are objective. They don't depend on what anyone thinks about them. And then we've got the fact that you can't give a scientific account of why scientific rationalism is superior. So
Mm.
really the question is philosophy, is metaphysics, in the sense in which Plato does it and that Socrates does it, possible? Or are we stuck with the kind of scientism that Popper thinks is the real solution.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the two frameworks that are scraping against one another. And I think at least if you regard that there is an objective reality and that it has aspects to it that we can apprehend, however minimally, then that gets you the ability to talk about facts or values or the interrelation between these things and then build up two political systems. If it's just bare scientism, then I don't see where Popper's getting any of his thick values claims at all, let alone the specific ones with respect to tolerance or pluralism or the, the main shibboleths of liberal democracy. I don't know how it is that those things just magically drop out of the magic hat of scientism.
Yeah, exactly. And even the claim to somehow do without philosophy or metaphysics makes no sense, because as a philosopher of science, Popper has a metaphysics anyway that you can't scientifically establish or demonstrate. Science has all kinds of metaphysical presuppositions. So the claim that just because you are not going to agree with Plato's metaphysics, you're going to do without metaphysics, doesn't hold up.
Correct.
The other mistake he makes, that John Wilde points out, is that Popper commits a serious historical error in attributing the organic theory of the state to Plato and accusing him of all the fallacies of post-Hegelian and Marxist historicism. The theory that history is controlled by the inexorable laws governing the behavior of super-individual social entities, of which human beings and their free choices are merely subordinate manifestations. Now, people who followed the 2 lessons on Plato will know that Plato's view is actually the opposite of this. So he says that social order is the manifestation of what is going on within the soul of the
Mm-hmm.
individual. So
Mm-hmm.
society is the soul writ large, whereas for Marx, it's basically the opposite. There are these inexorable historical laws, and the individual basically has no choice. You're just pushed around, buffeted by economic reality, and that's what determines your life.
Mm-hmm.
Plato
Yep.
says no, it starts in the soul, and then society manifests whatever the spiritual state is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a correct point that Wilde has against Popper. I think Popper's yeah, way too fast to lump Plato in with the same sort of historicism that Marx and Hegel are guilty of.
Right. And then the other complaint Popper has is thinking that Book 8 of the Republic is supposed to be an account of concrete history. But really, what Plato is saying that uh, given the reality of human nature, this is how things play out.
Mm-hmm.
This is how it works. So, natural law means that man has a nature just like a tiger does, for example. You can understand it and what your end is based on it, or you can fail to and try to choose different things as your proper end, but you can't. You're not in charge of what kind of creature you are and what is objectively good for you. So Plato's saying that ultimately you either have reason as the controlling force in human affairs, and natural law is just action that is rationally consistent with what human nature is, or you're going to end up with some kind of slavery to appetite or force being in control. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
opposite of totalitarianism, really, because Plato is arguing for rationality as being the organizing principle of society, not
Mm-hmm.
force.
Yes.
Right. We covered a lot today. We're just under an hour. So we'll call it there. Thanks for the questions, guys. Enjoyed those. And next week, we're going to be starting on Timothy Gordon's book, The Case for Patriarchy. So make sure you grab a hold of that and start your reading. We'll be looking at the opening chapter. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Thank you, Dr.
Thanks a
Roblard,
lot.
as well.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Take care.